Good morning to everyone if you're on the West Coast. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today for DST's first webinar of the year, The Promise and Implications of California's Evolving Solar Policy. For those unfamiliar with DST, we are a distributed energy solutions provider with unparalleled capabilities, including solar and energy storage development, structured financing, project acquisition, and long-term asset ownership. DST accelerates the deployment of renewable energy resources and creates significant value for our commercial, industrial, and municipal customers and partners. We have a large portfolio of solar projects in California and are active in various policy undertakings in the state. Just a quick intro about me. My name is Pari Kasotia, and I lead all the policy undertakings at DST, ranging from federal to state efforts. I'll be moderating our webinar today. So just a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be recording the webinar in case some attendees are unable to join today, and if you would like to share it with your colleagues. Second, we'll be taking audience questions towards the end of the webinar. If you would like to pose a question to our panelists, please share that via the chat box directed to DST Renewables. So let's get started. California has always been at the forefront when it comes to clean energy initiatives and adoption. Policies adopted in California not only serve as a blueprint for its own decarbonization and clean energy goals, but also a pathway for other states to see what has worked and what needs to be tweaked. So today we are going to take a deep dive on some of the emerging topics that would impact California's clean energy landscape, such as NEM 3.0, storage, community solar, and the impact of federal policies such as the IRA. To do so, we have our esteemed panelists joining us today. In alphabetical order, we have Stephanie Doyle, who is the California Regulatory Director for Wood Solar. She works to advance distributed solar storage and complementary clean energy policies in the California regulatory and legislative space. Previously, Stephanie spent over 8 years in Washington, D.C., working on federal climate and energy policy at Nature Conservancy and Citizens Climate Lobby in both grassroots advocacy and government affairs capacities. She has a Master of Science degree in Energy Policy and Climate from Johns Hopkins University and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Washington. Next, we have Frank Tang. Frank is the Head of Business Development at OnSwitch, a technology-driven solar developer and national EPC. Frank was previously Vice President of Account Management at Redaptive, overseeing energy as a service solutions for large national energy users. Frank was also a VP in JLL's Energy and Sustainability Services practice over 10 years, developing customer solutions and implementing building carbon savings for more than 150 million square feet of global corporate real estate. He started his career in clean energy and global warming policy. Frank is an alumnus of Stanford University and Presidio Graduate School's MBA program. And last but not least, we have Rick Umhoff, who is the Senior Director and Counsel for California at the Solar Energy Industries Association. Rick directs SEIA's solar market development efforts in California, as well as oversees SEIA's policy work in the Northeast and Midwest regions. Rick has extensive experience advocating on behalf of the solar industry at state agencies and legislatures throughout the United States. Rick holds a JD degree from University of San Francisco and a BA in philosophy from the University of California, Santa Cruz. So thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. So I think the first place we would like to start is just understanding the California energy landscape. So if you can touch on what's on the front line when it comes to renewable energy in California, and what upcoming policies and initiatives does the industry and the market participants need to pay attention to? So whoever wants to take that first.
Hi, Pari. I'm happy to kick us off with that, and thanks for having me and SEIA participate in the webinar. Looking forward to a good discussion here today. I think one way to think about the policy landscape in California is to look at the challenges California is facing. California is really struggling with reliability issues, with rate issues, meeting our climate targets and sort of the reality of deeper decarbonization as we move beyond just the power sector to decarbonize. And so we're seeing policymakers attempting to respond to those challenges through a variety of policies. So some things that are really on the horizon right now that folks should be aware of are things like the income tiered fixed charge proceeding that's happening now at the PUC as a result of AB 205, the emphasis on procurement and on resource adequacy reform to shore up reliability on our grid, the need to increase transmission distribution infrastructure upgrades and the challenges in doing that, the challenges around interconnection and interconnecting to the grid across the board for projects of all sizes and even outside of the energy sector in sectors like housing. And then also new programs coming online to increase access to renewables, like the community solar program that's currently active at the PUC. And then, of course, the implementation of the net value billing tariff, which is a new successor to the net metering program in California. So a lot happening across the board on the policy front in California.
Any thoughts from Stephanie or Frank?
Sure. Yeah, obviously Rick touched on most of them, but I think I would add that, especially when it comes to the implementation of NEM, that it has and is going to continue to make storage an even more necessary part of going solar, especially for residential customers. And from a policy perspective, it means we need to ensure that folks who struggled to afford solar before and now have the additional burden of finding a way to get solar plus storage can afford it. And that can come from incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act or state funding like the Self-Generation Incentive Program. But it's going to be crucial that there's an emphasis on ensuring that we aren't leaving people behind as we enter this next stage of energy policy in California.
Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think the equity is really important. And I think a lot of what we're doing in California just feels like we're fine-tuning things as we've set really the foundation for really advanced clean energy policy. And there's a lot of the nitty-gritty that we're working through now. From my standpoint, and thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel as well. As an EPC company, our vision is we want to get solar out as much as possible to customers. And one of the things that's inspiring also is I think good to celebrate. I saw an article last week that California set a new record for renewable energy offset of our grid demand. I think we hit net zero with just solar and wind generation sometime last Sunday. And that's an awesome thing to celebrate. It's really, I think, a huge milestone. Obviously, the spring energy load on the grid is pretty light, and we're getting a lot of good solar and wind resource at that time. But it's tremendous that we're actually hitting net zero fully from renewables on the grid. I think what we're seeing in the policy world is now that that's happening at 12 noon in the middle of the day, is all this policy trying to figure out, okay, how do we structure incentives so that we balance out the rest of the grid, because that's going to start happening more and more. So it's something to celebrate that solar providers and customers are adopting a lot more renewables, but it is causing a lot of changes in the utility rate structure and grid management that's very needed. One of the big things facing us right now on costs is AB 2143, which was passed last year. That would categorize all commercial projects as public works effectively, which requires prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And so we're tracking that one closely, as that will increase costs across the industry for commercial solar projects.
Yeah, definitely a lot to celebrate. I think California has a lot of broad policies around clean energy and climate change. And now the question is, how do you adjust to the realities and offer the right incentives and the right rate structures to make it work? So let's switch to our topic of NEM 3.0. There was a big departure from NEM 2.0 and NEM 1.0. So curious to hear your perspectives on how do you see that impacting the commercial solar landscape in California. And we're focusing on commercial customers, but let's also talk about industrial customers and residential customers. So what would be the immediate impact of NEM 3.0?
So I can start with that maybe on terms of how we see and how we're talking to customers about NEM impacts. At the crux of it, in case folks haven't been following NEM 3, which is now called the Net Billing Tariff or the Solar Billing Plan, lots of names there, but essentially it decreases, it significantly decreases the value of exported solar, where for solar that's not being used behind the meter, anything that's surplus and being sent back to the grid, the export value is significantly decreased for those systems and for those customers. In addition to a lot of other effects that my policy colleagues can probably speak to, the key to that is that essentially there's going to be definitely a finer grain analysis during your solar evaluation phase for a commercial customer as to what exactly is this solar going to do in offsetting my usage for the next 20 years, right? And how are the rate changes going to affect that? How is the export rate going to affect that? And then how does my level of export reduce the value, and how can I mitigate that? And really, I think probably two of the main ways you can mitigate that drop in export value are, number one, you could reduce the sizes of your system, or you can just, depending on how much you're using on site, it just depends on how much you're generating, but probably 60 to 70% of your load offset is going to minimize your export and therefore the reduced value, or you add battery storage to reduce the amount of export you do, manage demand charges, and export when it's more valuable. So I think really it feels like those are the main avenues where commercial customers can look to see impacts in NEM 3 and how to mitigate them.
Yeah,
I
would add to that. I think agree with all what Frank just went through. I think kind of looking at what is going on with the net billing tariff is helpful to sort of why the state's going there is helpful to kind of understand how to respond to it. The state is essentially moving to a value-based export framework, as imperfect as it is, in an attempt to sort of start to send a different price signal to solar customers, and very strongly a signal that says you should do storage. And we want your energy at times when we need it, and when times we don't need it, do self-supply, and we're not going to pay you as much for the energy. And that is, going back to earlier point Frank was making about the amount of renewables on the grid now, especially solar on the grid. That is a response to our shifting energy mix and the sort of increasing need to have more of our clean energy trying to help meet the peak in the evening hours when costs are highest on the grid and emissions are highest on the grid. So that's kind of the theory behind it. It is a significant reduction in the export rate for solar customers. That transition is going to be challenging for the industry. Storage is not as readily available as we would like it to be. Costs do need to come down, and financing structures are likely going to have to change. There is a less of a lock-in period on the export than what solar customers and companies were used to. So there are going to be some real impacts on the industry as a result of this change. And frankly, SEIA would have liked to see a bit more of a transition period for the industry to adjust. We were supportive of evolving the NEM framework to respond to the state and grid's needs, but we do think this is going to be a pretty radical shift that's going to have a it's going to be hard on customers and hard on folks out there selling systems for some time, and it's going to take some work to also get the financing mechanisms in place to help support the C&I market going forward. So I'll stop there and see if Stephanie wants to add anything or turn it back to you, Pari.
Yeah, I think just from a looking at low income residential perspective, you know, under NEM 3.0, adding solar still can create an opportunity to be a savings mechanism. But like Rick mentioned, the value of the export is much lower. And we know in general that serving low income communities is a higher cost than the general market. So all of the issues for a general market NEM customer are going to be amplified for a low income customer. And there is a low income residential adder for the export rate that will help for low income customers to see more savings over time. But again, ensuring that storage is accessible and affordable, especially for those low income and disadvantaged households, is going to be a big issue. And then one other piece that we may touch on is, I think, helping people understand the avoided cost calculator, which is the mechanism that determines those export rates, is really important. It's a really complicated mechanism. It uses 576 values versus 6 under NEM 2.0 for the year. And I think just helping people understand what their savings are going to look like and how to take advantage of their solar and storage systems is just going to be really important, and helping people understand those payback times and what they're looking at.
Yeah, if we can maybe expand on the avoided cost calculator a little bit. So from your opinion, either of you three, what are the limitations of ACC right now? And where are some areas where there could be potential improvements to truly reflect the value of the export rate?
Sure, I'm happy to take a crack at that first. So for folks who aren't familiar with the ACC, it's a tool that CPUC to evaluate demand side programs and resources. And over the last few years, they've indicated that they want to use it to start to set the compensation for some distributed energy resources, including solar and storage. Again, kind of going back to this idea that what gets sent out to the grid should be compensated sort of closer to the value. So during certain hours of the year, let's say peak summer hours, there may be significant value there and the compensation is much higher. And then during, let's say, spring, midday hours when there's a lot of solar and available on the grid, the compensation would be lower. And so it's a kind of a seasonal and a temporal tool that attempts to sort of capture the value and send that signal to the customer. It is kind of a value stack based tool in the sense that it identifies different value streams or avoided costs, essentially, that the system should be compensated for, or a solar storage system should be compensated for. So those are things like energy capacity, transmission and distribution, avoided emissions. And so there are a number of value streams in there that are reflected in the calculator. It is an imperfect tool. It is a tool that needs a lot of refinement and work. And the commission is beginning a new process this year, actually, to update the tool. And it'll do that every couple of years going forward to refine and improve upon it. Some of the missing value streams are things like avoided methane emissions, which is a significant climate contributor. Natural gas forecasts are way off in the calculator at the moment, much too low, as we've seen spikes in natural gas prices around, in California and around the world. Avoided transmission costs are still too low. So there are areas where it's really just missing some of the value that distributed resources provide, and it does need work. It also is a forecast, so it's imprecise in that way as well. And it's always difficult to forecast out what are going to be the peak hours of the upcoming couple of years, because those hours do move around. So definitely need some work. But the idea is to kind of get at really kind of more of a value of solar style export compensation.
Yeah, I am sure many of us who are attending this webinar would like to be engaged in that ACC revision process. So Rick, what would be the best way for our attendees to stay involved in that process?
Yeah, so there's a new proceeding at the Commission, Public Utilities Commission, where they're going to be basically reevaluating the avoided cost calculator. I believe it's called the DER framework. And you're encourage folks to get in touch with SIA. We'll be active in the proceeding, or if you're part of a trade association, they may be active, or you can engage directly as well. And people can reach out to me if they want more information.
Great, that sounds good. So I also wanted to expand a little bit on the storage itself. And Frank, you talked about, costs have to come down. There are other challenges. So if we can uncover that a little bit, theoretically speaking, everyone assumes storage is a solution. We should just add it and get an improved value from NEM 3.0, but it's not easy as it's said. So what are the barriers, apart from the cost, that commercial customers need to keep in mind as they're thinking about storage solutions? So Frank, I'll start with you. Rick, would love to get your opinion. And Stephanie, if you can touch it from residential sector, especially low-income households, what are the challenges for that sector to integrate storage solutions?
Sure. So I think in addition to, so it's just to acknowledge that with storage, systems will cost more. And the whole evaluation will be how much more valuable will the storage be, so that whole process of doing that analysis and looking at the trade-offs is something companies like us have to get very good at. And also customers are just going to need to understand. It just adds complexity to the evaluation process of, is this solar and storage solution right for me? When increasing the cost, if a customer is going to be spending capital on a project, that increases ultimately the budget that they have to spend. So that's going to be tough for folks who have limited capital appetite. Under a financed arrangement like a PPA, there'll be a much easier pill to swallow when adding storage. Not all customers, I would say, would need to add storage. I would just note, generally on-site solar, if you're looking at either just rooftop or just carport, certain customer types will not be space constrained for that type of renewable resource, or will be space constrained, I'm sorry. So folks who use more energy on site, a lot of refrigeration loads, for example, like grocery stores or warehouses, like cold storage, manufacturing sites, certain retail applications, big box retail applications, they might use more energy on site than they can actually offset with an on-site solar rooftop or carport project. And so they may not be exporting that much at the end of the day. And so it's not automatically an assumption to make that adding storage will improve their economics. The barriers of adding storage could be, it's adding additional criteria to making sure a project will pencil. So looking at the load profile of the building to determine is there actually enough export potential where adding storage will help shift that export to the areas in the evening when it's more valuable. There's also the practical matter of, is there space to locate a storage system, whether in the building or outside the building? If outside the building, can you build the infrastructure to where you can place that storage and an equipment pad? You have to take up parking spaces. Is that going to impact aesthetics or local jurisdictional requirements? So there could be very practical matters that could limit the opportunity for storage, especially in California, where we have especially in the metropolitan areas, valuable real estate. Adding storage outside and taking up parking spaces or space around the building can be difficult, and running all the wiring necessary. So those could be barriers to adopting more storage. In addition to Rick mentioning, certainly the cost of storage need to come down to help improve those economics. And then we're facing general supply chain lead time challenges that the rest of industry is facing too. So I think, lots of things to figure out and good things to work on.
Good topics that most people probably aren't thinking about, just the logistics of getting a storage system on a facility. Do you have land constraints? Do you have wiring constraints? All of that. So those are some good important points. Any thoughts from Rick or Stephanie on other barriers from your perspective that we should explore?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the cost is the big one for residential and particularly low income households. I think it's also important to think about that for a lot of low income homeowners, their homes are older, and so they may also need retrofits to the home before they can even get solar and storage, and that just adds additional costs on top of everything else. There are opportunities, like I mentioned, through the IRA and some state funding through the self-generation incentive program. So I think it'll be important for developers and folks to help residential customers find those rebates and incentives that can lower those costs for them, and connect them to programs when it does come to things like fixing their home so they can have a storage system with their solar.
Yeah. Rick, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I think those are all great points and definitely consistent with what we hear from our companies. I mean, some other issues that come up are things like getting local jurisdictions comfortable with you know, permitting of storage and fire code as it relates to things like fire codes and sort of, you know, this is a new technology, right? That's not, in a sense, it's not that new. I mean, we have, you know, these batteries and all kinds of applications, but it's coming on very strong as in sort of a new application, and getting local jurisdictions and officials comfortable as well, interconnecting on the residential side, getting customers comfortable, making sure that contractors know how to install storage. So there's just a lot of sort of practical commercial implications to integrating storage into systems, both on the residential and a commercial scale. And I do want to emphasize the supply chain challenges. I mean, it has been a very real challenge for us for some time now, and it's something that you know, especially policymakers need to be considering as they're implementing policy that assumes that storage is going to show up.
Yeah, all good points for all of us to keep in mind and figure out solutions. So I want to shift from on-site solar to off-site solar. So thinking about community solar. And CPUC currently has a community solar docket that they are exploring, and they're also thinking about revising existing utilities green tariffs program. So Stephanie and Rick, could you talk about how a community solar program will fill whatever voids there are right now in the clean energy program offerings, and why is that important at this point?
Yeah, I can start. So California currently lags behind other states in the country when it comes to community solar. As of 2022, 22 states plus Washington, D.C. have active and robust community solar programs, while California's community solar equivalent programs, the green tariff programs, just haven't been very successful. And last year, there was a bill passed from Assemblymember Ward, AB 2316, that created a pathway for California to create a new community solar program that requires 51% of capacity to serve low-income Californians. That bill also required the CPUC to evaluate the current green tariff programs and then decide if there's going to be a new program. So that is currently happening now at the CPUC. But we're really excited to see a new potential pathway for renters and communities for whom building solar on their rooftop just isn't as feasible, to get the access and the benefits of solar and storage. And additionally excited that there's so much IRA funding and potential state funding that can bolster the potential savings for subscribers to that program, beyond just what the tariff can provide. And currently renters, and especially people in multifamily housing, they just don't have many options for going solar. Under that new NEM 3.0, they're still evaluating virtual net energy metering, which is the current way that renters can have access to solar, which also people need to rely on their landlord to make that decision. So community solar fills a gap where people can subscribe to get the benefits without necessarily needing it to be on their household. And I think it's just going to open up a whole new set of customers. 45% of Californians are renters. So it just provides a whole new opportunity for folks who really want to get the benefits.
Any thoughts from you, Rick?
Yeah, I think we're also excited about this new program that's under development, and hopeful that PUC will move quickly on getting a program established. A couple of, I guess, additional details. Similar to the net billing tariff, the main proposal in the proceeding recommends using the ACC as the basis for compensation. These projects are going to have more, they're going to be primarily export. So most of the compensation will come through export. We think one way that this fills a gap in California's energy landscape right now is that we have a real capacity problem in California. We have a real reliability problem, and we're having a lot of trouble bringing new projects online and upgrading the grid to be able to handle additional solar and storage and other resources. And these are going to be smaller, locally sited projects that can fit into load pockets where capacity is needed, that can be deployed quickly, that will have storage attached to them. The structure of the tariff, if approved as proposed, would send a very strong price signal to developers to use storage, to include storage in the projects. So we really think that there's an important sort of missing gap here of projects that can be deployed quickly, provide clean energy, and provide reliability at a local level, which the state desperately needs right now. And so we're hopeful that the commission will recognize that and move quickly, not to mention the additional benefits of expanding access to solar, helping with energy bills, and allowing more folks to participate in the solar transition.
Are there, from your experience of working in other states, are there any best practices that we should bring to California as we are thinking about the design of the community solar program? Just making sure we are not repeating some of the gaps that we may see in other states.
Yeah, so Vote Solar has worked in many states over the years to get successful community solar programs in place. And two of the things that I think make for a good program are robust consumer protections and simplified billing, which makes it so a subscriber pays one bill rather than two bills to the utility and to the developer. And really just making things as easy and transparent as possible for folks to sign up. And I would add that we see a potential for community-led and community-owned projects to be potentially possible through community solar program, which, and then again, like Rick mentioned, in addition to reliability issues, can provide more value than just direct savings for folks. And then I think, as mentioned, because the way this program is currently proposed to be designed would almost require storage. That's something that not a lot of other community solar programs have, and I think would put California kind of at the forefront of what a community solar program that has storage built in would look like.
Absolutely. And at DSD, we are closely tracking how things develop around community solar. That is a big part of our business. So we'll see how that unfolds. I know we sort of mentioned IRA, so let's switch to that topic. California would benefit a lot from the IRA provisions, whether it's under the energy communities because of all the brownfields that we have, or whether it's low-income communities because there are a lot of Indian lands and also low-income census tracts. So how, from your perspective, how do you see the IRA impacting California's energy programs and energy policies? And do you anticipate any shift as a result of the IRA?
Well, I'd be interested to hear Frank's take on how he thinks it's going to impact his business and how they're looking at it.
The IRA has been really interesting to digest and then to take forward kind of into the market and how we work with customers. Part of the interest is that they declared this all last year, and then they're still rolling out guidance that's expected probably to finalize not till later this year. So there's this kind of year-long period where we're all wondering what's going to happen. And we're trying to communicate to customers and set expectations and and ultimately do projects with that amount of uncertainty where we're sitting in right now. I will say that it's opening up a lot more opportunity for sure, because projects that maybe didn't have great economics before will now have a really strong leg up with being able to take advantage of a 30% ITC with adders for 10% for being in an energy community just by virtue of geography, another 10% by being in a low income census tract or community, and then potentially even be able to take advantage of domestic content or US content materials. And so I think we're going to see a lot more. It's been a lot more like a puzzle in terms of figuring out, okay, what kinds of locations and customer types can take advantage of those great adders, and then how to communicate and help customers understand what's the potential here for that and whether they can take advantage of it. I would say, just practically speaking, a lot more focus is going to be on these geographical locations where you can get these adders. So everybody's trying to figure out what's the map, what's the mapping of these locations, what's the best place, what's the sweet spot where you can take advantage of the most adders, and helping customers understand the solutions they can take advantage of there. I'd say also, generally, for example, OnSwitch has done a lot of carport or a lot of rooftop projects, and we're doing more carport. Carport typically being more expensive than rooftop projects, but because of the benefits of the IRA and then also the adders potentially with domestic content using the steel from carports, that carport projects are now starting to pencil a lot better in California. And so I think there's going to be this also a big swing and a more move towards carports, especially in the private sector, because those economics are much better.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts, Rick? If not, I have a follow-up question for either of you. So I totally agree. I think suddenly you are exploring new sites and new customers that you previously would not have thought of. I think all of that is great. But we also have multiple market constraints. So we talked about supply chain. We talked about, kind of touched on workforce issues, so workforce shortages, and then also the permitting and interconnection challenges that could potentially slow down the rollout of IRA funding and IRA benefits. So want to get both your perspective, Frank, from a developer, how are you addressing those market challenges? And then Rick, from a trade association's perspective, what advice would you give to commercial developers to really start planning around those issues?
So particularly around supply chain and those types of
shortages.
Yeah, right.
Permitting, interconnection, all of that.
Yeah. Well, to talk about supply chain, certainly there are persistent supply chain issues, and it seems like we're kind of playing whack-a-mole a little bit with supply chain. Last year it was modules because of the federal tariffs potential, and then there was lots of different types of commodity materials that were impacted. Now we're starting to see generally across the industry AC gear, especially more custom, larger AC gear has long lead times and a big backup in supply chain. So being able to manage around that, along with the inflationary pressures we've been experiencing as an economy, has just been quite a challenge in terms of being able to provide customers with a project with a price and trying to keep that price steady over time while keeping the project schedule expectations in line too. So it's been a lot for developers to juggle for sure. I would also say that in terms of workforce, I think we all face a very, very big challenge in workforce in this industry. The move to required prevailing wage in California will be really interesting to see, partly because wages will increase for the industry, which we would hope would increase in attraction of new workers to the industry. In addition, with that prevailing wage, there's apprenticeship requirements, and that's great because that will keep the pipeline of new talent coming into the industry. So I think those changes are really important for long-term, viability of our industry. and things we're following very closely. It's hard to hire workers out there in solar. And so I think that's really important for us. It will increase costs to customers in some cases, but I think long-term viability is important, and that workforce is a key thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear Frank's perspective on that. Being a solar developer, we obviously interact with a lot of different developers, but kind of looking at it from, I guess, a market and policy advocate perspective. I mean, one of our messages to legislators and policymakers is, we're ready to deploy this technology. Solar has arrived, storage is coming on strong, and there are a lot of bottlenecks that are preventing us from being able to do it at the scale we could otherwise do it. And one message I would deliver to the audience and folks who are in the development community or potential customers is making sure, to the extent you work with a trade or directly with your representatives in your districts, that they understand those bottlenecks and that they understand the commercial limitations for you all, because they do want to help, but they don't necessarily have the expertise or the ability to help without that information. So things like interconnection. Yesterday, the California legislature had a hearing on, I think, like 6 bills around interconnection. So clearly there's interest, and that is a major bottleneck. Workforce is something that we're really focused on, and we really, we see it as a major limitation for deployment. Folks should be very aware of AB 2143, which is the bill that Frank referred to, that's going to require prevailing wage. If you work in this space, you need to be aware of that and being getting your shop ready for that. And thinking also about how does the industry contribute to workforce development? What can we do to expand the pool of workers? How can we reach out to communities who otherwise, have been less served by the industry and less included in the industry? And what can we do to help develop the workforce? I mean, we're going to have a whole entire generational shift in this industry, and the IRA is just absolutely supercharging the demand for our product. And with that is going to come a lot of work that's going to be needed to make sure that we can actually get the job done. And that means training new workers and bringing new workers into our industry. Additionally on supply chain, that's something that SEIA is very focused on. We're very focused on trade issues. But it's important, again, at the local level, for folks to be hearing that, from you if there are limits you're facing around supply chain and inflation. And then one other thing I want to flag for folks is, if you are in this industry, you should be watching, what's happening in Congress as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act. It is becoming the next big target, and we need everyone mobilized to, let your members of Congress know how important it is to this industry to protect the Inflation Reduction Act. We can't just assume that it's done, it's here, and there aren't going to be, folks who come after it. It has become a big political target, and we're going to need to defend it because it is, a huge win, obviously, but something that we all have a vested interest in defending. So I again encourage you to work with your trades or work with your local representatives to make sure that they know how important the Inflation Reduction Act is to your business.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to add one other thing that I think is important to think about because so many of these incentives are putting a greater emphasis on projects in low-income and disadvantaged communities. I would just advise developers to really lean into community engagement and thinking about partnerships with community-based organizations and local groups that can not only help communities understand projects better, but will also speed up some of the barriers potentially to permitting or people pushing back on projects. And so developers who do have experience in that, I'm hopeful, can lead the way and kind of show folks how to do that well, and hopefully get projects built, both for the people who need them, but also in a timely fashion.
Totally agree, Stephanie. I think because of the emphasis on energy equity under IRA, all of us need to do a better job of reaching out to the communities and figuring out how do we create new structures that increase the equity, which is the goal of this big IRA, and also increase access, or not just access, but also workforce development opportunities. So all of those are important issues for developers to start thinking about as well. Going back to the IRA point that you made, Rick, a couple of federal bills that we should all be paying attention to if we are not. One is House Joint Resolution 39, and the other one is House Resolution 2811. House Joint Resolution 39 focuses on the solar tariffs that would take away the 2-year moratorium that was placed last year by the Department of Commerce as a result of President Biden's executive order. And then HR 2811 is related to the Inflation Reduction Act and taking away the funding under that as part of controlling the debt ceiling. So both of those are important. They are being talked about in the Congress right now. So if our audience has not paid attention, now is the good time to really start looking at those and actively participating in persuading your local representatives on that. I know we have about 12 minutes remaining. I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So let me see.
And Pari, if I might make a quick shameless plug, SIA, you go to SIA.org to get involved in the efforts in Congress around this. So we have sign-on letters, we have lots of ways to get involved. We also are looking for folks to do ribbon cuttings of their projects to talk about the success of the IRA and the economic kind of development resulting from it. So please feel free to get in touch, and we are fighting the fight, but the more folks we can have helping out, the better.
Okay, so thanks for that, Rick. That's important. One of the questions we have is, how is interconnection playing a role in all of this? What are the challenges that interconnection currently poses for California? So whoever wants to start talking about that.
I can take a shot at that. Interconnection is absolutely an important piece to focus on. I think Rick mentioned or maybe Pari mentioned there was discussion about a lot of different legislation coming out in this area. We've just come through a wave where people have been scrambling to submit a bunch of applications under net metering 2. There's going to be a delay in interconnection approvals. I think I've heard up to 6 weeks from the utilities. And then as solar continues to grow in California, I think we're going to start to see more and more constraints in the local distribution networks for interconnection. Where that translates to developers and customers is really more uncertainty around a project, right? If you're trying to look at a project for your site, there's going to be maybe increasing chances that because of interconnection, it's not viable, or there could be cost prohibitive upgrades needed. And I think the more transparency we can have into the grid ability to handle solar on a project level, the better for the industry, not to mention the speed at which those interconnections are reviewed and approved. So I know we have interconnection maps in the utilities and we can look at general capacity, but I think the more we can get finer grain of detail, more certainty in that, will help the rest of the industry be effective in determining where is it good to focus solar for customers and where is it not, where is it going to be prohibitive.
Okay. Any thoughts from Stephanie or Rick?
I guess I would just add to that. I think what we're seeing right now is utilities are basically overwhelmed. They're having trouble interconnecting new load. They're having trouble interconnecting renewable projects, large and small. And I think for developers, I think y'all should just be very aware of that. And I think you are for the most part, but just go into it eyes wide open, knowing that there's going to be delays and it's going to be difficult. I think our message for policymakers has been the utilities cannot be the roadblock to us achieving our climate targets and having a reliable grid. And if they can't get it done, we're going to need to figure out a way to make sure that either they can or there's another way to do this, because it is reaching a kind of a crisis level, frankly. And we're really pushing hard on making sure that they're not getting in the way of our ability to achieve our goals and deploy this technology. So That's kind of the big picture message. I think one of the challenges with the issue is that it's a multi-pronged issue. Depends on where you are on the grid, depends on what type of resource you're connecting. And a lot of it does have to do with the utilities making the necessary investments in upgrading their grid to be able to interconnect projects.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question. We have not talked about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So this question is, how can you get the most value of solar deployment when you pair it with solar, or when you pair it with storage or EVCI? So any thoughts on just integration of solar plus storage plus EVCI?
I'd say I think in terms of EVCI, there's a lot of different applications to think about. There's kind of really large scale installations like fleets, and then there's kind of more kind of smaller systems, at a building, at a commercial building, for let's say visitors or employees of a building, generally in the commercial sense. So I think it will be challenging ultimately to see how EVs cross over with the new NEM 3 timeframe. Ideally, we'd see solar or people charging. Ultimately, if it depends on when people are charging at the building. If it's employees, they'll be charging hopefully in the middle of the day during business hours and not in the evening. So pairing it with solar will help reduce the exports of solar, and you can take advantage of that solar behind the meter to charge your vehicles. To the extent you're starting to charge in the evenings, then you might be reducing your ability to get export value from solar, or generally, how the rate structures change will depend on ultimately how much you're paying, and those rates are increasing ultimately in the evening times. So it's a complex picture. Just determine when people are charging, how that's going to match up with your solar and storage, and how you want to manage that all. I don't think there's an easy way to answer that.
Yeah, certainly very complex. Lots of things to keep in mind. We have time for one more question, and this one is for everyone. So beyond the policies that we already discussed, what is one absolute policy change that California needs to work on to improve energy security and reliability and meet its climate goals? So just your perspective, what is missing right now that you would like to see in the policy space?
I guess I'll go first. There's obviously a number of things that need to happen, but I think one area that is really lacking is the ability, the virtual power plant space, the ability to aggregate DERs, the ability to use DERs as a fleet is still very much lacking. We're kind of stuck in this constant pilot mode, and we have, we're going to have millions of solar and storage systems out there, and we need to use them in a coordinated fashion and take advantage of those resources. We have batteries sitting in people's houses with, that are stored, that have energy in them that could be deployed, that's not being deployed for the grid. And a lot of that is just a regulatory problem. It's not sending the right price signals, having regulatory hurdles in the way of being able to build a business around that at scale. And that is an area that really needs a lot of attention and work from the state.
Agreed. Stephanie and Frank, any wish list?
Yeah,
you?
I would say I agree with that. And obviously all the interconnection issues would, I think, be the top one. But another one I think is just ensuring that policymakers are valuing distributed energy resources appropriately and accurately. We talked about ACC needing updating, but I think a lot of policymakers still see DERs as burden on the grid rather than thinking creatively about how they can help solve some of our issues. And then I would also just add that, as we keep growing this technology, really ensuring, again, that we're not leaving any communities behind, and particularly not expecting that just because technology is expanding everywhere, that it's just going to make its way to everyone. I think policymakers need to be really intentional with the policies they're setting that are accurately reaching the goals that we want to see, both from a climate perspective, but for electrification as well. And putting that funding into those policies that we want to see succeed.
Intentionality is the key word there. Totally agree. Frank, any wish list for you?
I'd say the main thing really around interconnection for the industry as a whole. There's a lot of headaches there, and I can't point to exactly one policy to fix it, but I think it's a key area of focus to continue our ability to grow as an industry and make sure projects are viable. And I'd say just generally, following up with that, just a recognition from policymakers that, especially on the commercial project side, projects take time to develop and they take time to build, especially in today's day and age of supply chain constraints, of interconnection and permitting, all these things that generally take time that are often outside the control of an EPC company. And so just really making sure policymakers understand that timeline it can be longer than they might probably think, and any new policies should include good phase-in periods and acknowledge that there are a lot of projects that are contracted waiting to build, that are building in progress, or in various stages of waiting for sign off, and just recognizing that we don't want to disrupt projects that in that in between state.
Yeah. Really good points. I think, Rick, some of the points we should think about how to expand on from a policy perspective. So we are at time. I do want to thank all of you for your participation today. Lots happening in California, lots of moving pieces. DST will continue to engage on some of these policy topics, and we hope you all and our audience does that as well.